Hello, everyone. Welcome to another English language episode of Futucast. It's a pleasure to be with you, every listener and viewer of the show. My name is Isak. I'll be your host again for this episode. Let's get right to the actual show. This is a big thing for me. I just told our guest Rutger Bregman this a bit before that when we started this podcast, like maybe 7-8 years ago, me and William, who is now a former co-host of this podcast, we were thinking about potential guests to have on, and one of the dream guests was you. And now it's an absolute honor to have you finally on the show, Rutger Bregman. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks. Likewise. Well, obviously, I've been waiting for it for 7 years as well. So it's great to be here.
It's been a long wait for both of us. So it's a big,
yes.
big day for both of us. Absolutely amazing to have you here. We have an hour, which is quite a long time, but it's not an infinite amount of time, and it's going to run out because you've written such an amazing, long, interesting book about moral ambitions. I was thinking, skip the small talk, let's jump right into the actual book itself. You've written a book. If I had to summarize it in like a few sentences, you can tell me if this is wrong, just to kick this off. You're sad about a big waste that we have in society these days. Mm-hmm. People are wasting their talent, their human capital, as some people say. And instead of wasting this talent, you think people should be more morally ambitious and do morally ambitious things in the world. Can you tell our listeners a bit more about what this means? What do you mean that people are wasting their talent, and what do you mean that they should be more morally ambitious?
Sure. So I think that readers of my book will know that I've always been fascinated by this waste of talent. Already in my first book, Utopia of Realists, I talked about, those socially useless jobs, those people who can go on strike and then, nothing really happens. I always loved telling the story of the Irish banking strike. It's the only strike of bankers that I know of that happened in all of world history. Strike lasted for 6 months. Nothing really happened. The economy just kept growing. And after 6 months, the bankers came back and said, all right, we'll get back to work. Now, if you compare that to, say, the strikes of garbage collectors or teachers or nurses, well, those strikes really hurt because they have essential jobs. But I've always been fascinated by how is it possible that we're wasting so much talent? And how is it possible that the people who consider their own jobs to be socially useless are often quite well educated and have nice resumes and often earn really excellent salaries. They maybe even went to great universities like Harvard or Cambridge or Oxford or you name it. But what's happening to all that talent? What's going wrong? And I guess I came to this realization that this is like the big overarching meta problem of the world. That just not enough really smart, talented, ambitious people are working on the biggest global pressing issues, right? There's so much talent being wasted. Many people will have heard the famous quote from someone who worked at Facebook for quite a while and said, the best minds of my generation are making us click ads, which is a little bit sad, obviously. And the message of moral ambition of my new book is it doesn't have to be this way. I think that the most driven, most ambitious, most talented people should work on the most important global problems. And this is sort of a self-help book that will, hopefully help people to find their own morally ambitious path.
Yeah. What do you think, if we think about people who are ambitious, but not in the moral sense, as you define it,
Mm-hmm.
Is the answer just as simple as the golden handcuffs are good enough and they feel nice enough? You get status, you maybe get a nice house or two, you get a nice car or two, you can afford a few vacations, and then it doesn't really matter. You find a way to justify your job and make it sound nice if anyone asks you, but it's not like big enough of an existential issue for you to get rid of that lifestyle. Is it that simple?
Sure. Well, that's definitely part of the explanation. So obviously, the somewhat socially useless job or even the harmful jobs, they often pay, a little bit better or sometimes much better. So, say you're working in the tobacco industry, we've got a lot of evidence that shows that indeed these kind of sinful industries, they have to pay their employees much higher wages because, no one really likes it if they have to say that they work for Philip Morris at a birthday party or something like that. Or I assume most people wouldn't like that. So they're compensated with a much higher wage. But then, yeah, it's really interesting what's going on there. Let's zoom in on, say, a hypothetical 25-year-old who had just, finished his or her studies at a prestigious university. This person always had the highest grades, right? Participated in all kinds of honor classes, and then is faced with the question, okay, what's my first job going to be? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? And then you look at what the other people are doing. You look at what other really driven, really talented people are doing. And you see that they go to places like, say, Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or some corporate law firm. Now, what's the main reason they're going there? I would say it's partially the money, but the more important reason is that those are just the places that, they provide these young people with a couple of things. One is optionality. So they say, you can just join McKinsey for a while. You'll learn a lot. It'll be a great experience. And maybe 4 or 5 years from now, your journey can get really started. But, this is just a way of postponing your decision of who you really want to be in this life. The other thing is that these young, talented people, they just want to work with other really dedicated, talented people. They just go where all the other talent is going, right? In that sense, it's classic herd behavior. They like the intellectual challenge of working at these kind of companies. If I look at some of my friends, back from university days, those people with whom I had many conversations about how we would change the world, right? How we would solve world hunger, how we would make this world a wildly better place. Well, quite a few of them have ended up at places like McKinsey or some corporate law firm. And again, I don't think money is the main reason. It's obviously a nice add-on, but the main reason is that they just wanted to play in the Champions League. They just wanted to do the most high status thing. Yeah. They wanted to have the most stimulating job. And I think we have to be honest here, is that there are just not enough jobs out there for really ambitious idealists and really ambitious do-gooders. So I think we need to create more Champions Leagues for idealists. Right now, if you look at university like Harvard, I think around 40% of Harvard graduates go into consultancy or finance, around 20% into tech, and only a few percentage points go to work for a nonprofit. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that there are many amazing people who work for nonprofits like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, but we just need way more of them. So anyway, long story short is if you're thinking about what are some of the things we really lack in the fight against some of those biggest global problems, yes, capital is one thing, but I would say the most important thing that we lack here is talent.
Right. Okay. I think a lot of people at this point are thinking like, really, is it this dichotomous? Are the Venn diagrams this separate? Like, can you be professionally ambitious and at all morally ambitious? Because I would imagine that most people at least feel like they exist somewhere in between the extremes. Do you think that reflects reality? Do you think there are jobs that people do mostly for work and status and stability, but that still actually do good in the world?
Sure, of course. So, I mean, obviously a lot of corporate lawyers and bankers and consultants and managers, I'm not saying they're all making the world, a worse place. They're contributing something, but I often think that there's a huge gap between how talented these people are and what they could actually contribute. So the opportunity costs of them being a strategy consultant, I would say very big. We need these people. But this is obviously, this is just one part of the somewhat simplistic Venn diagram that I came up with. So these people are quite ambitious, but not very idealistic. You also have the opposite of the Venn diagram. So that's more my bubble. I come from a leftist progressive bubble, and there you will find a lot of people who are very idealistic, but not very ambitious. So they tend to say things like, small is beautiful, or less is more. They tend to be obsessed with their own footprint, right? They will tell you that you can't eat meat, that you can't fly, that you can't use plastic straws, that you certainly can't have children. And yeah, if they do all the things in the perfect way, then their footprint has been reduced to zero, and they might as well not have existed at all, which is obviously not very impactful. They also tend to be obsessed with the kind of words that they use to describe all the injustices in the world, right? So it's very important that you use the right words, the right pronouns, and yeah.
It all seems to be very
that's really problematic as well.
Yeah, it seems very problem oriented instead of solutions oriented.
That's part of it, but yeah, I would say the most important problem here is that it's not ambitious enough.
Right.
It doesn't recognize how much impact we can make if we really dedicate our lives to a great movement or to a great goal that tries to make this world a much, much better place. So yeah, that's the double message of the book. To those idealists, I'm saying, you can be quite a bit more ambitious. And to those people who are already quite ambitious, I'm saying, well, maybe don't waste all that ambition on something, that doesn't really matter all that much.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the young, idealistic, non-ambitious people for a while, because that's a very interesting thought. Do you think that that's like a generational constant, or is there something about like youth these days? Because I've made an observation, this might not be true, but anecdotally this feels true, that young people, that there's the term ambition has a bad connotation somehow. It seems like you're... It seems like it's kind of there's a bit of a spillover from the professional ambition or materialistic definition of ambition. There's a bit of a spillover to the entire umbrella term of ambition there, maybe. And then another thought that I might have, that like, why are young people so hyper idealistic, it seems, these days, caring about the biggest issues in the world and talking about them all the time, and seemingly being very aware, as people use that word a lot these days, like be aware of things. One thing that, again, anecdotally feels true is that it's become much easier to cash in on idealism without doing the actual work because of maybe social media. It's become quite aesthetic and quite performative. You're able to project to the world that you are idealistic and then be able to reap the rewards without actually deserving it somehow. Does that resonate with you as well?
Yeah. It definitely feels true for me as well. Virtue signaling in that sense has become much easier. And it's easy to forget that going viral on Instagram or what happened to me, like shouting taxes in a place like Davos, is not the same as actually achieving things, actually getting a law through parliament or having a majority after an election, achieving results.
Yeah.
And that is definitely something that you see in a lot of recent protest movements. So in the book, I talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, which was the biggest protest movement in the history of the United States, but with, I would say, disappointing results. So there was little legislation passed after it. And then people will say, well, it has created more awareness. And I'm not saying that awareness is useless, but I am saying that awareness is often very much overrated. People are aware of so many things, right? We know that billions and billions of animals are tortured in factory farms on a daily basis. Yet the vast majority of us still eat the meat from those tortured animals, and we don't think about it all that much, or we try to push those thoughts away. We know about the many human rights abuses in our supply chains, but, we still buy all that crap because it's convenient for us. So I think awareness is very much overrated. And the question is, how do you bridge that gap between awareness and action? One of the chapters in the book is called Winning is a Moral Duty. And sometimes there's a tendency, I would say, particularly among progressives and leftists, to think that there's something noble about losing. About, oh, we've lost the elections again, but at least we were on the right side of history. Well, no one cares about that, right? The people who are currently suffering, whether it's in poverty or, whatever else they experience, they don't really care that you were right. They
Right.
want you to win.
Yeah, is it
that is essential.
Sorry for interrupting you. Is it literally them thinking that losing is noble, or is it a byproduct of something else? Like perhaps that ideological purity is something that should be achieved. Maybe this is something to do with the aesthetic thing that we were talking about before, that it's very important to seem very pure in your morals. But yeah, that's a very interesting point that you said there. Like, why do you think pragmatism and political effectiveness, just effectiveness in general, is seen as kind of secondary? It's seen as kind of opportunistic, maybe a bit Machiavellian. Why am I getting at the right strings here? Why do you think effectiveness has such a bad reputation?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time studying the great movements of the last 2 centuries. So actually, for me, writing this book started with spending about a year researching the abolitionist movements. And I was mainly focused on the British abolitionist movement because that was the most successful one. It really fascinated me to learn that actually in all the other European countries, abolitionism was a failure. So in the Netherlands, for example, where I'm from, there was really this purist mentality. So there was a small group of Orthodox Christians who were against slavery, but they didn't want to work with the more liberal Christians because they didn't start all their meetings with prayer. So they felt that was more important than actually achieving results. In the end, they did manage to organize a small petition drive, gathered around 800 signatures. But then 10 years later, when there was a petition against the Catholics, well, that one got 200,000 signatures, just to give you an idea about the moral priorities of my countrymen at the time. Now, in France, the abolitionists, it was a group of writers and intellectuals who got nothing done. In Spain, there was very little happening. In Portugal, well, the standard work about abolitionism in Portugal is called The Sound of Silence. So not much of an anti-slave trade and slavery movement there either. But in Britain, it did become this huge movement. And there are a couple of facts that really, really struck me. One was how small it initially was. So that reminds me of the famous quote from Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." What I also discovered was that it was founded by 12 individuals. One of them was a writer. So there is a place for someone like me. One was a lawyer, but 10 out of 12 were entrepreneurs. So people who had built their own companies, who had grown and who had scaled them, and who were now thinking about, what is my actual legacy going to be? You know, maybe I've got this, say, toothbrush company right now, but is that what I want to be remembered for? Well, I learned a lot, you know, building that company, selling a lot of toothbrushes, but I can do so much bigger things than that. And that is really what I call moral ambition. It's about building a legacy that matters. And when I learned that, it was quite an epiphany for me. It was like, maybe that is indeed what so many of these idealistic movements today lack: a kind of entrepreneurial energy, a kind of pragmatic energy. Then I also started learning about, indeed, how, on the one hand, how radical this movement was, because it was really, really radical to be against the slave trade and slavery in the late 18th century. You know, it was very, very unpopular to say those kind of things. And you know, it was a very, very profitable industry. So it was very radical. But then the people who fought it were very pragmatic. One of the things they discovered was that it was very ineffective to keep pointing out the suffering of Black Africans on these slave ships. They just discovered that argument just did not resonate all that much in Westminster. Because this whole colonial system, it was very far away for people. You know, most people had never been to one of the colonies. They'd never seen a slave ship. Just did not resonate. But then they started doing some research, and they discovered that around 20% of the white sailors, so basically the perpetrators in this evil system, that they were dying as well. And that many of them were not being paid after the voyage because they were already dead. And that really shocked a lot of British people at the time. And then these abolitionists realized, hey, wait a minute, but this could be a much more effective political argument against the slave trade. This is what psychologists call moral reframing. Yeah, it's a form of strategic empathy, right? You just think really hard about what is going to work in the minds of my adversaries, or in the minds of the people I I need
Yeah.
to make things happen.
Now the
And
idea,
if you're in this puristic mindset, you're never going to find those arguments, right? But if you're really serious about actually achieving results, if you care about actually winning, then suddenly those kind of things start making sense.
now the purist idealist might say, aren't you justifying this change for the wrong reasons? Do you think that matters?
Well, that's just what history is. In history, the right things happen for the wrong reasons all the time. So get used to it, I would say. That is just a fact of life. History is very weird in that respect. We like to think that it is some kind of Star Wars, where the good guys fight the bad guys and then hopefully they prevail in the end. It's not really what it is. And very often the people who think they're the good guys, they're actually the bad guys. In some respect, I think, the historians of the future are probably going to be horrified by some of the things we do today. Yeah. That's what history is like, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And that's maybe a good realization to have. This resonates with me. I agree with a lot of what you say here, especially when it comes to like ambition and trying to aim high. But I'm trying to play devil's advocate here for this question. Mm-hmm. If I'm one of these idealist, non-ambitious people who genuinely thinks that it's good to think local, good to think small, good to focus on what's around you and not try to reach further away than your arm can actually reach, both for reasons like pragmatic reasons, but also for your own mental health maybe and your own well-being. They might say that, okay, there's this, they might say, okay, and I agree with this too, like, okay, on one hand, you have moral ambition on this one side, this kind of virtuous ambition, this positive ambition causes a better change in the world, or causes a change for the better in the world. And then on the other hand, the other extreme, the completely nihilistic, dysfunctional, destructive type of ambition is kind of maybe the Andrew Tate type of ambition, like very hedonistic, very materialistic, very extractive kind of the world. Like the world is only there for your own pleasure. But isn't there a bit of a horseshoe theory here as well, where both you and Andrew Tate are saying that, hey, if you don't aim high, if you're not part of the 1% of world changers, you're not aiming high enough. Like that's the least you should be aiming for. I mean, by definition, 99% of people can't reach those goals. Do you think that they should hinge their life on that expectations? How do you stop yourself from being a virtuous Andrew Tate when talking about this?
Well, maybe we need virtuous Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
Maybe that is exactly what we need. I would much prefer that to the real Andrew Tate.
Same. Actually, a good answer. Yeah.
So let's go back to the famous Margaret Mead quote. It's small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens who change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. So a lot of idealists really love that statement. It gives them warm, fuzzy feelings like, oh, we're being ignored right now, but we're going to win in the end. I've always thought that it is a really brutal statement, especially the second line. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. What Margaret Mead is saying there basically is that the vast majority of people just do not change the world. We like to we live in a democracy where influence is, somewhat evenly distributed. At least we all have a vote. We all have something of a say. But I don't think that is what reality is really like. I think that indeed Margaret Mead was right in that it is very often these small groups of really committed people who basically have a massive outsized influence on the course of history, for the better or for the worse. So I gave you one of the wonderful examples, the abolitionists who got this huge movement started in Britain, and then Britain was instrumental in ending the slave trade in around 80% of all countries globally. So they launched this huge maritime campaign against slavery. There are other beautiful examples like the suffragettes. It was also very small initially. In the US, only 68 women came together for the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls in 1848. And only one of them was still alive when women finally got the vote in 1920. She was sick on the day of elections. So I've always been inspired by those small groups of people who really committed their lives and careers to this great cause. But then obviously there are horrific examples of the same mechanism as well. I mean, read up on Lenin, read up on Hitler, how small their initial circles were, but also how dedicated they were. That is just, I think, very often how history works. In that sense, the book is an invitation to become a part of one of those small groups, because I think it's important to emphasize that it's not something you're born with. Moral ambition is not some kind of genetic thing. It is more like a way of seeing the world, and it's a quite contagious way of seeing the world. And everyone can be infected by that mentality. So it is true that throughout history, those who have had a bit more privilege often had more opportunities. So Thomas Clarkson, one of my favorite abolitionists, well, he received a quite substantial inheritance from his father that helped Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the main U.S. suffragettes. She had very wealthy parents who gave her an amazing education. But then there are also amazing examples of very morally ambitious people, like, say, Rosa Parks, who was a seamstress, but was one of the great, brilliant activists of the 20th century. And people actually underestimate how smart and how pragmatic she was in achieving her goals. Got one chapter about that in the book as well. So, yeah, I think this way of seeing how history plays out is both a bit exclusive, but also inclusive. Yes, it is true that it's small groups of people who determine a lot, but anyone could be a part of those small groups. Anyone can be more, maybe the right word is agentic, right? Waking up to the realization that you're not just a cog in the machine, not just a small little wheel, but you could have so much more impact if you wake up to that realization.
Something that struck me in your book when you were talking about these small groups that you call a cult, that you should create your own cult and have your own cult and have a mission, was that something that seemed to power these small groups and these cults was like massive conviction in their mission, in their ideology, in their worldview, massive conviction. And that kind of conviction, the level of conviction many of these cults had, is not really conducive to a lot of nuance, at least in like your worldview. You can't see the world as this complex place where there are very complex cause and effects, because you never know what your change might do. You have to believe in your solution and believe in the problem, more or less, I think. In my job, I've sort of adopted, maybe unconsciously, a purpose, which is like try to add a nuance to the public conversation when you do these interviews, because that seems like a very important thing to do. Maybe I have some arguments for that. I think it's a valuable point of view, and I think a lot of people think that as well. Like in today's culture, a big problem is how black and white we are. Do you think it's the opposite? Do you think we aren't black and white enough in this world? Do you think there are problems that are like easy fixes? Like everyone should agree, we should fix this, and we should agree on how to fix this. Do you think that it's rather that way?
I love that question. It's a difficult one. So obviously there's a tension between ambition on the one hand and what some people like to call scout mindset on the other hand. So there's a great book by Julia Galef called Scout Mindset. And she distinguishes it from soldier mindset. Soldier mindset is where you have a deep conviction and you're trying to defend it at all costs. You know, this is often how people who are religious tend to behave, right? You give them some counter arguments for, well, there are 5,000 religions in the world. Maybe, you know, one of the other religions, you know, has some truth to it. And they're not reasoning in an open way, like, let's see where the argument leads, but they already know what the answer has to be because their identity is vested in that answer, right? They just need it to be true because otherwise they're in trouble. This is soldier mindset. It's a little bit like a lawyer behaves also during a court case, right? This person has to be innocent or he has to be guilty. Now, scout mindset is very different. If you're in a war and you're a scout and you're being sent into the field, obviously your job is to report as accurately as possible what is happening. It's really essential to get the facts right, to see the world as it really is, and not as how you want it to be, as how you like it to be. And the interesting thing is that if you actually want to achieve results, so in that sense, if you want your ambitions to be fruitful, scout mindset is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's so easy to be ineffective and to delude yourself. So in that sense, I think you got to ask yourself the question, on what level do I have to be really convinced? I think you shouldn't be a big believer in a particular solution or a particular method. You should be much more pragmatic about that. So some people have these big debates about, does activism work? Like, does Extinction Rebellion, does all of that work? Or do we need more lobby for good? Or do we need more entrepreneurs? And to be honest, I think all those debates are a little bit silly, because these are all tools in a toolbox, and sometimes you need this and sometimes you need that. So in some circumstances, it's a mass movement in the streets. That's what you need. And sometimes, well, you need more entrepreneurial energy. And very often you need all of that. You know, it's actually the activists who give a lot of oxygen to a movement, put things on the agenda, and then that gives more opportunities for, say, the entrepreneurial types or for the politicians or the lobbyists to get things done. So I think you have to zoom out a little bit further and think about, what is the more meta thing that you want to be really passionate and dedicated to? And I think it's quite important to make that as abstract as possible. So making the world a wildly better place. You can zoom in a little bit further, I would say. So there's some things that, I am quite convinced by. Something like the way we treat animals today is one of the greatest moral catastrophes of our time. To be honest, I find it very hard to see any argument, and it's so obvious to me. But how do we get there? How do we get from A to B? How do we actually abolish this system of factory farming?
Yeah.
Well, there are so many promising methods, so many ideas, so many tactics that could work. And I think in that space, it's really important to hold on to this scout mindset. But at some point, you have to make some choices as well.
Yeah.
Right. So I often like to make the comparison with Gandalf and Frodo. Right. So at some point, Frodo decided, you know what, Sauron is the bad guy. Right. And we need to throw this ring into the mountain. And that's the most pressing issue the world faces right now. And I'm not gonna do another podcast. Like, is he really bad though?
Let's
maybe
hear the other side.
Maybe orcs have rights as well.
Yeah. It's a good, funny idea. Well, since you called it a silly subject, I want to bring it up. I actually wanted to ask you about Extinction Rebellion, but not for like no reason, for a specific reason, because I'm in Finland and I'm from Finland. And we just recently had one of these like stunts, and it's like raised this conversation again. So I'm curious to hear your opinion. I think it was a Swedish organization called Återställ våtmarker, which is like restore wetlands. There's a Finnish company, a government-owned company that kind of extracts, what is turva in English? I don't know. I'll just copy paste it here, but this like thing you find in the ground that you can burn for energy. Damn, I should know what this is in English. Anyway.
Oil, coal?
No, neither one
gas.
of those. It's a very weird Finnish thing, and I think it's the only place where we actually still do this. But it's CO2 emissions, basically. That's all you need to know.
Yeah.
So they're protesting that in a collaboration with Extinction Rebellion. This happened in one morning. It was last week, I think. They took like these big canisters full of red paint and went to the Parliament building in Helsinki and sprayed the columns. We had this like gorgeous neoclassical Parliament building with these big columns, all covered in red paint, dripping down the stairs of the Parliament building. Quite a striking sight, even for someone who sort of dislikes, maybe especially for someone who dislikes their method of protest. You couldn't miss it. It was quite striking. And now they've been cleaning it up for a while. The porous granite of the building has sucked in some of the paint, so it seems like it's going to be either very expensive or quite permanent. The paint damage, and even like some moderate Extinction Rebellion supporters have said that this is maybe a bit too much. Finns are quite institutionalist. It's a very hard sell to become to attack your democratic institutions here. So you hear a lot of this, like, okay, I support their cause, of course, and of course, like extracting this thing from the ground is bad and everything. We should change this, but this is not the right way to do it. So what would be your contribution to this conversation, this silly conversation?
Well, I think it's an important conversation, actually. So I'm going to give you a very pragmatic answer here.
Okay.
I think we just have to look at the research. And there's quite a bit of really interesting research into this question. Does it actually work? One of my favorite organizations in this field is called the Social Change Lab, based in the UK. And they've got a couple of people who are both activists in the animal rights movement and in Extinction Rebellion, but who are also sociologists and psychologists and who know how to do a really rigorous scientific study. And so they know when a new protest is coming up. So then they do a poll in advance, and then they do a poll after the protest. And I've taken quite a bit of time to look at this kind of research, and I think the main finding again and again is that, well, obviously these people are very unpopular. So Extinction Rebellion is not a very popular organization among most people. But does that really matter? Like, is it the goal of Extinction Rebellion to be a popular organization? Probably not. They're not participating in elections. That's not their method. What they want to do is to give oxygen and to a certain debate and to set something much higher on the agenda. Are they effective in that respect? I would say the answer is quite clearly yes. Like every day, the news is dominated by another stunt pulled by Extinction Rebellion. It's not dominated by some right-wing politician making up stuff about immigrants or something like that. Yeah. So in that sense, it very much works. And it actually gives some space for the more moderate, more nuanced people to distance themselves from XR and say, well, that is obviously, that is very distasteful. And, I strongly disagree. But yeah, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, right? And I think very often it provides these more moderate politicians with the opportunity to
bring it up,
to actually do some stuff. I'm often amused by how much people who are actually in the same movement can hate each other. And they just don't really realize that they're working on the same cause, but just with different methods. Now, I'm not saying that, these kind of things can't backfire, but I think most of the research that I've seen on the effectiveness on these climate movements is that they've been really successful at increasing the saliency of climate as an important political subject that has to be discussed in Parliament. Sometimes it's called the Greta effect, yeah, so I think that it's actually quite effective. It's also very cheap. You just need to buy the paint. You need a relatively small group of people again, and you have an insane amount of media attention. Just imagine how much money it will cost to have the same amount of attention if you just buy ads.
Yeah,
I mean that's like millions and millions and millions, right?
Right.
But for them, it was only a couple of $100 probably in paint, and you need some volunteers. So in that respect, my hat's off to them.
Yeah, like my friend had a good theory because they've stopped showing this in like big football games like Champions League and World Cup and stuff. And my friend's theory was that they got a call from a lot of companies that were like buying the advertisement on the pitch, saying that, hey, you better not film these people. I paid you 10 million for this ad space, and they paid you nothing. So you better not show this because I want value for my money, because otherwise we're going to come up with a stunt like this. Like we're going to have someone run naked on the pitch if we can get this for free instead of paying 10 million to get like which is, I think, a pretty interesting and good theory.
That's fascinating.
You said something really interesting there in your previous answer about some people working towards the same goal and not necessarily even realizing it, and maybe even thinking that they're opponents. Can you speak a bit more about that? Do you have any examples of this that might surprise people?
So as I said, I spent a lot of time studying the abolitionist movement in the late 18th and the early 19th century in Britain. And it was just sometimes so funny to see exactly the same mechanisms on display that we so often see today. So for example, in the 1820s and the 1830s, the slave trade had already been abolished, but slavery itself not yet. There was still a huge empire of colonies with the institution of slavery. And then there was the old generation of people who had already spent decades in the movement, who all were gradualists. So they deeply believed that slavery had to be abolished in a gradual way, and that, just abolishing it with one stroke immediately would, be very dangerous and subversive, and that we shouldn't go this way. Then there was a new generation of young people, a lot of them actually women. This was also the moment when the women's rights movement was born, who were much more radical. They were the immediatists. And they started insulting these younger people, right? They talked about the slumber of the dead. They started insulting these older people. They talked about the slumber of the daddies, for example. And just reading about that really gave mixed feelings to me as a historian, because I had already spent a lot of time studying these older abolitionists, and I was really impressed by how much they had given up. How much of their time and energy they had devoted to this movement. And here are these young people coming in, who haven't had any experience so far, and then they just start insulting and shouting at these older people. It felt like very inappropriate. But then on the other hand, it's also like, well, this is exactly what the movement needs right now. It is true that it needs a bit more radicalism right now. It is true that the path of gradualism, well, it just doesn't work. There's delay after delay. There needs to be some new energy in this movement. So I thought it was very funny to see something like that on display, because I've seen it in movements today as well, is that sometimes these young radical activists come on the scene with very little knowledge of what has happened in the last 20, 30 years, very little knowledge of how many sacrifices some of the older activists have already made, very little knowledge of, well, basically how the basic politics or work of a certain subject. But still, they provide something that is sometimes quite necessary. So that was really funny to see. What was also fascinating to see is that, the pioneers of today can also be the, how to put this, be the barbarians as well. So there was this famous moment in 1840 when there was a big international anti-slavery convention in London, where they were celebrating that slavery was finally abolished in the British Empire. And here there were hundreds and hundreds of people who had spent decades and decades fighting the system. Thomas Clarkson, the great British abolitionist, was giving a keynote speech. He was in his 80s at the time, a very frail man. And it was such an emotional moment. Just reading description of that event brought tears to my eyes. It was like, holy shit, these people have really done it. But then a couple of hours later, after that keynote speech, the abolitionist men, deliberated what they should do with all the women present at that conference. Because, as I said, the women really started to play a leading role in the 1820s and the 1830s. They were very often the immediatists who were saying, we need to be much more radical, and that's exactly what was needed. So the men deliberated and said, you know what, the women are very welcome at this conference, but not to speak and not to vote, but they're welcome to watch from the balconies. And then you're like, holy shit, but these people, they're my heroes, right? They're the moral pioneers. They were on the right side of history. How can they be such bigots? Well, that's very often how history works, right? It's the moral pioneers aren't like perfect. And then the story continues from there. There were two women present, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who were incredibly angry, went back to the United States and organized this first women's rights convention that I mentioned previously, Seneca Falls, and then also devoted their whole life to fighting the patriarchy and actually getting the right to vote, which they themselves did not even experience because they already died when the 19th Amendment was passed and women got the right to vote in the US. So anyway, long answer, but I'm always fascinated to see those mechanisms, and I think we often see them on display today as well.
Yeah, definitely. I might be belaboring this point, but that was just an interesting thing you said there about his history and how messy it is, and how often we look at people or events from the past with like revisionistic lenses. And obviously, it's understandable. We have our own moral frame of reference that we've grown up with, and it's, at least in the Western mind, maybe in other minds as well, we universalize values quite often. We consider that we judge every single one according to the same standards. And but what would you say to someone other than that, if they say that, oh, we can't appreciate people in the past or respect what they did if they also had something backwards and bigoted associated with them?
Yeah. I was recently at a dinner of my British publisher.
Yeah.
And I was sitting next to this journalist from The Guardian. And we were talking about the history of the slave trade and the slavery. And he was making this point that, people who are quite decent human beings, who are, friendly to most of the other people around them, who may give something to charity, could still be implicated in some really horrible things, some moral catastrophes. And he was using that as an argument to be a little bit, how do you say that, pessimistic and cynical about us humans as a species.
Yeah.
And I was saying, you know what? Yes, I agree. And I was pointing at his plate in front of him. So he was eating quite a bit of chicken at the same time. And I was like, well, probably some of your grandchildren will be quite horrified about what you're eating right now. And then it became quite uncomfortable. And I was like, oh, why do I have to do the Dutch thing or to be so direct? Throughout history, people have always liked to believe that they are the most civilized people who've ever, walked the earth. The Romans believed that they were really civilized, and they enjoyed these gladiators slaughtering each other very much. They enjoyed it when naked women were thrown before the lions. And that was just, good entertainment during lunchtime. Today, obviously, we're horrified by that kind of behavior. And we like to think that, we are the civilized ones. But what are the odds, right? There have been many, many civilizations throughout history. It would be quite coincidental that we are the ones who have figured it all out.
This is the end of history. I think it's
quite unlikely. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not a moral relativist. I'm not a moral nihilist. I do think that there is moral progress. I think that we have made a lot of moral progress since, say, the late 17th, 18th century. And I think there's a certain directionality as well. I've always loved the book by Peter Singer, The Expanding Circle, about how we have expanded our moral circle throughout the ages to include more sentient beings. And there's a certain, as I said, there's a certain directionality here. It is only logical that once you start abolishing the slave trade and fighting slavery, then those kind of arguments can also be used to start fighting patriarchy. And it's not a coincidence that, like, almost all the suffragettes were initially abolitionists. It's also not a coincidence that a lot of the abolitionists and suffragettes were also vegetarians, right? There is a certain logic behind this, that once you start expanding your moral circle, once you start giving more groups of people and animals rights, and once you start taking them seriously as sentient creatures who deserve to live a flourishing life, then why stop at one point, right? And I just think that today the journey has not ended yet. We're in the middle of the journey. We have indeed abolished slavery, so slavery is illegal. It still exists, but it's at least illegal in every country worldwide. We have, in many places, given women the right to vote. But we're not there. We're really in the middle of the journey. And there are today moral pioneers working on the next step who I think will be considered the abolitionists of today.
Speaking of Peter Singer, he has a really interesting thought experiment that you also reference in this book. It's the boy in the puddle, or the shallow pond, or whatever it is. Basic idea. Just for the listeners who haven't read this book, I think I've referenced this thought experiment before in this podcast, but just to rephrase, just to reiterate, you're walking somewhere, maybe to work, you see a small kid drowning in a pool or a shallow puddle. It's not a big deal for you to go rescue the child, but for the child, it's a huge deal. You rescue their life. You literally save their life. Most people would say that you have a moral duty to do it. You have to go save that child. Most people would agree. Now, there are many people, many kids in the world right now in the moral equivalent situation as that young drowning boy in the puddle. They're about to die if someone doesn't help them. And we don't really think about those children because they're far away from us. They're outside of our moral sphere, in a sense. Mm-hmm. But nowadays, in 2024 and even before this, we have many, many tools and many, many ways in which we can contribute to these young kids' lives, as an example. And I could go donate to a charity, the best charity that I can find. I could maybe start my own fundraiser or do some project or whatever. There's so many things. It's not a lack of options that we have. And this is just one problem in the world that you could fix, like dying young kids. There's many other things that you could do. So if you now buy this, let's say I accept this idea that there's an opportunity cost to every choice that I make, how can I ever justify any level of hedonism? How can I justify any level of self-indulgence, any level of mundane pleasure? How can my mundane pleasure ever be more valuable than rescuing someone's lives? Why shouldn't I completely obsess over this problem? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole movement that's been founded on this thought experiment. So Peter Singer is one of the fathers of the so-called effective altruism movement. And these people are taking this thought experiment very seriously. Indeed, they've calculated that it takes around $5,000 to save one life if you donate it to a really effective charity. And they started doing it. It is, I think, one of the most interesting, also most problematic, and also most admirable movements of our time. So I have very mixed and complex feelings about it. We could do another hour podcast on it. What I really admire about it is that this is a movement of doers, of people who take this fundamental insight about the world we live in that it's a very unequal, very unjust world, and that we can just do stuff, right? We can save the child's life. I admire that very much. This is a movement of people who will often have donated their kidney to a random stranger because they've looked into the evidence and they discovered that, there's actually, the risk of donating that kidney is relatively small, and you improve someone else's life so much. If you're on dialysis because your kidneys are not working properly, I mean, that's horrible. And you get an enormous benefit from having someone else's kidney. And we've got two of them. We only need one. So that is very admirable about that movement. I think what I don't like about it's big parts of it seem to be grounded in guilt. So that thought experiment that you just mentioned, to me, it feels like a form of moral hijacking. Is that suddenly I have to feel guilty about all these things. And that's just not the right way, I think, at a very fundamental level of living your life. I think I'm a pluralist, so I think that life is about many things. It's about music, it's about art, it's about love, it's about friendship, it's about fatherhood, about motherhood, about being a good friend, a good brother, a good sister. It's about all of that. It is also about morality. It's also about, playing a good role in society or as a citizen of the world. So I think there is an important role for morality, and I think that very often it should play a much bigger role in people's lives, especially once they realize that they could do so much good. And you have a career anyway, so you might as well make it a very morally ambitious career. But we're using this book, Moral Ambition, as a launching rocket to build a different kind of movement that I think should be grounded in enthusiasm. So I've co-founded an organization called the School for Moral Ambition. And we're not really using that thought experiment to make people excited about joining this movement. Instead, we like to invite people to think about what kind of legacy they really want to build, right? You've got only one life on this planet. A life on average lasts for around 4,000 weeks. It's around 2,000 work weeks. That's 10,000 working days. It's 80,000 working hours. And all of that time, you can only spend it once. So no matter how rich you are, you can't buy yourself more time. So try to make the most beautiful piece of art of it, where indeed morality does play an important role, because it's just one of those really enriching aspects of living a meaningful life. And then try and do something worth remembering. This is sometimes the message I have for people who are, say, in the Forbes 400, or I don't know what the list is called in Finland. Most wealthy people, in my experience, are quite boring. That's also the problem with all these McKinsey people that we talked about at the beginning of this podcast. And, the standard leftist progressive approach to those people is to say that they're greedy. Well, then they're like, oh, you're just jealous, you can't keep up.
Yeah.
So my advice is don't call them greedy, call them boring. That hurts them way more. No one wants to live a boring life. People want to live a meaningful life that was worth living. And that, I think, is in the end what moral ambition is all about doing something worth remembering. That's the reason why today we still, read the stories of the great abolitionists and the suffragettes, because they were part of one of those small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens who made this world a wildly better place. And so it's that kind of storytelling approach that I would much prefer over the child in the pond thought experiment. Even though, as I said, I admire those people who take seriously the lessons of that. And I don't admire the many people who keep whining about, oh, we need systemic change, we need to overthrow capitalism, we need blah, 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 but then don't do anything themselves.
Yeah. I think it's a beautiful place to end this. I mean, as you said, could continue this for another hour, but this 1 hour for now is good enough. Thank you so much, Rutger, for joining our show.
Thanks, man. This was fun.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thanks, listeners and viewers. Hope you enjoyed this. There's going to be more English language interviews for sure in the future, so stay tuned and subscribe to our page. Yeah, most of our interviews are in Finnish, but there's going to be English ones sprinkled in between. So, see ya next week. Bye-bye.